Security chiefs face prison. High Court finds Interior CS Fred Matiang'i, Police Boss Joseph Boynet, and Immigration Chief Gordon Kihalangwa in contempt for disobeying orders to free opposition activists. Before we come to the lawyer, Bwana Simeha, this has been happening. About 10 plus orders, especially with regard to what has been happening to Miguna, have simply been thrown into the rubbish bin. No one is bothered to even respond or even act on them. Where are we headed in?
You know, as Wakili had said earlier, there's always a tendency when people are in power, when you have some kind of power, it's a human thing, that you think you can act, you can treat anybody and everyone with contempt. But you see, that is why we have rules. That's why we have things like the Constitution. That's why we give upon ourselves principles and values that guide our society, laws, procedures of doing things. Even just amongst ourselves, you know, there's some kind of social etiquette around this table. It is to guide how we relate to each other, to avoid this kind of incidents. But so when you have people doing this, it's because they are deciding that at that point, they are so powerful that nothing is going to deter them, not even a court of law, not even the law itself. So they raise themselves above the law, above the Constitution. But guess what? To me, this is temporary, because eventually, but unless something unexpected and drastic happens to this society, eventually it catches up with you, and it will catch up with them. Because this, to me, is no longer about them versus Miguna, neither is it them versus the individual judge who has issued those orders, whether it's Odunga or Chacha, Mita, or the other, or Aburili and any other judge. It's not about those individuals. It's about the way they've set themselves up against society. And eventually, in my opinion, this is going to catch up with them. For as long as we insist that we want to be a constitutional democracy, as Kenya, that want to be a constitutional democracy, we will have to deal with these things. You know, you've seen countries dealing with criminal matters that happened like 50 years ago, following and insisting that, you know, now there is evidence, or now we can prosecute this person who was so powerful then, but now, 50 years later, that power is no longer there, but the evidence still exists that they went against the law of the land. We must set it straight, put it on record, that current and future generations must never tolerate this. Okay. So for now, their power will protect them, but it's going to catch up with them.
Do you agree with that? Should we just sit back helpless here and say that anyone who disobeys court orders, even now, as long as they are in power, nothing will happen to them, at least in the short term? For example, we are seeing that, yes, yesterday the High Court Judge Odunga actually convicted this free gentleman and said they're due for sentencing today. They still hold their positions. If they're sentenced, is there any consequence to that? You know, the presumption here is that they'll be taken to jail. I don't think that will happen. I don't think they'll be taken to. The options for contempt are several. You see, the most obvious one is where we order, the court's order, that you'll be sentenced to a certain term. Of course, the maximum is 6 months. But there's something called sequestration, where then we order your car, your house, and everything to address a certain amount of a fine that you're supposed to pay. That is supposed to be under the custody of court, and then it can be sold. Now, that's the best way to deal with it, because you see, we've seen that because they have command, and they have the highest public command in terms of the people who would otherwise effect the arrest. You don't have to go that way. You look for other options. Now, one of it that hurts most is to go to your personal wealth, and order freezing of your accounts, and that can be ordered like he did to every officer, to every bank that holds your account, to freeze all your accounts, and order that your cars be seized or your house be seized and be sold to satisfy a certain value that's attendant to the offense and the conviction, and therefore the sentence. So it shouldn't appear like we, you know, what I see people tweeting is ordering an arrest of Matiang'i will not happen. Yes, it won't happen because of the fact that he controls the police. He controls the police. But there are other options, and therefore the fact that he's been convicted, the sentencing will have other variables. So it doesn't mean that he's going to be sentenced to be arrested. But does it have a consequence with regard to the oppositions? If you're convicted and you're a state officer and you're convicted for contempt, for example, does it affect your position or your continued presence in that state? You see, contextually, it won't. It ought to, yes, under law.
But contextually it won't, because the service and the circumstances of friction of the state which he represents right now and sits for, and the subjects. So he, I think, will be protected in circumstances for the time being. And any type of probably an argument that because he has suffered a conviction of that nature he should leave office, I don't think that will wash for the time being, because obviously he's serving a certain purpose. But I do know that this may be the last that he's holding such an office. Eventually, of course, historically, when he takes any other position, whether in this country, whether in higher position around the globe, I think this will be a reference point as to how he upheld the rule of law. And there's no place you're going to serve, whether you're running a kiosk or you're the UN Secretary General, that there will be no law to follow. Okay. Everybody must follow a law. So I do think that the circumstances of this issue are such that an attempt to abide by the law, as has been pronounced by the judges, should have been shown. I don't think that has been a constant anywhere. Okay. And I do think there's something that is being served, which is a short-term convenience. But the long-term convenience is a complete obliteration of the rule of law. You see, the social edifice must, as much as possible, be held together. Let me put a simple example. The role of the court is not to irritate anyone. It's akin to, let me put it this way, like a father who sees two children who are fighting. You go and separate them. You don't start hitting the father with a knife and beating him up. What you will do is respect him. What the courts do is they intervene where there's a friction and put people aside, and then now inquire, investigate. What are you doing? And what are you doing? Then you state your cases, and then a decision is made. That's exactly what courts do. Because there are the people who are being ruled, and then there is the executive. Now, the person who comes in between them is ordinarily the courts, against a certain set of laws made by a third party, who is Parliament. Okay. Now, I'll tell you how Parliament came to be, and this is very important. In the old times, it was only the king to say what needs to be done. If he says you're going to be killed, you're going to be killed. No parliament, no representation whatsoever. So then, because of taxes, there's this narrative that there cannot be taxes without representation. Because of taxes, there was an uprising against the king. Why? It is because he used to impose himself without being checked. So we created institutions of parliament world over, and all democracies. We created institutions of the judiciary exactly to check the king. And the king here is the Matiang'i and the like. That's why those orders are there.
Okay. Now, Gabriel, of course, CS Matiang'i is in power right now.
Right.
IG Boynet is in power. And the immigration boss as well. They may not really feel the effect of this court order or the sentencing right now. But looking at Jubilee as a party, President Uhuru Kenyatta trying to secure his legacy going forward. Yes, probably there could be a time when you need to exercise this kind of power, especially when it's something major and something dear to the president's heart, something that he really wants to push through. But should the state really be exercising such kind of power on an issue such as Miguna's citizenship?
Well, we look at the three that are being, held in contempt, and I really like what Wakili has gone on to say. And Fred, I really support the facet that following the law is actually the platform in which good governance finds placement. And if we walk away from that, we are walking into a situation where lawlessness will be the order of the day. Now, the catch-22 here is, and this is what's trending, and you've seen the likes of Benji Ndolo and the likes, both CS Matiang'i and Boynet, these are the people who are supposed to enforce that law. So, even if you are to push the court to go and arrest them, how do you do it? It is very hard, and we are talking this from the layman, point of view. So it is very hard. I think the goodwill that we are talking about, what must actually suffice is to be seen that yes, you have the power, but you're still, showing up when called upon by the third arm, of government. So here we have a scenario where we must ensure that these arms of government actually marinate, to execute an environment that is lawful. So how do we do about that? I think it's first of all by taking a chill pill. What is the situation? How is the best way for us to go about solving these issues? And by the way, Fred, this is something I have seen back to back, and Wakili has put it very clearly. Politicians are actually the biggest, threat to the kind of contempt we are seeing. You've had so many, back to back. Some will even say, Supreme Court my foot. Some will say, which judge? I won't show up, knowing fully well that you can get away with it. So do we want to perpetuate that kind of environment?
And are we there yet, Simeha? Is that where we are? Because this is not the first time that we've seen the High Court summon the police boss, the DCI boss, Director of Immigration, with regard to this issue about Miguna. They never showed up. None of them bothered. At least they sent some response back then, and that seemed to suffice. But none has been punished yet. Nothing has happened to anyone. Could we say that all this issuing of orders left the judiciary with egg on face?
I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say so. I think the judiciary is just doing its work and putting things on record. As I've told you, for now it may look like, and it does look like, these people will not face any consequences, that nothing would happen because of their positions of power. But look, my argument is, look at it in a broader sense, the governance of this country. The failure does not begin at the level of the cabinet secretary, an inspector general of police, and so on. The failure, for me, is higher up. Because if the person in charge of the executive was for respect for the rule of law, he would never, ever allow anyone under his charge to disrespect a court. He would fire them. Nothing personal. The fact that you have disrespected a court order, you have gone against a court order, you've thumped your nose at orders of a legitimate court in our jurisdiction, I cannot have you in my administration. You would refer them to the, of course, fire them. I'm not just saying also take arbitrary action. You'd where the law allows you, that if you, like a cabinet secretary, you'd remove them. Where the law says let it go through things like parliament and this body or a tribunal and so on, you'd immediately set up a tribunal. It's nothing personal. You are trying to show that, look, under my administration, I'm not going to allow anyone to disrespect a court order.
Yes.
We must all subject ourselves to the rule of law in this country, including myself. So I see the failure as starting from higher up there. And I put a higher responsibility on the president and the other people that are helping him to govern this country, because they are public officers, state officers. Other people can do this kind of thing, and it can catch up with them much faster because they are not public officers with that much power. But the president and the others have that much power. They are in charge of instruments of coercion. For me, it would take him to put his foot down and say, not under my watch. It's not I'm not going to let it happen. Even if this were his own brother, blood brother in government.
Yes.
I would expect that if he's a man who believes in the rule of law, that is what he would do. He would put his foot down and say, no, it's not going to happen.
In a short while, I'll be asking you about Miguna's political relevance, because when you see all this drama surrounding Miguna, you would imagine that he's probably gunning to be president or something like that politically. But before that, we also saw Justice George Odunga actually convict these three gentlemen in absentia. That is not something we're used to. Is that how the judiciary works? That you can actually, because they've refused to show up in court, this is not the first time, and probably even being summoned today for sentencing, they may still not show up. But is it normal practice to convict individuals in absentia?
No. It's not. In fact, I think that particular act in itself is open to challenge. But this is what I think goes on in the mind of the judge. What then is a judge supposed to be when he's supposed to protect a citizen of this country? He's issued orders that have been consistently disobeyed. What happens, the judge, is does the person who is not obeying his orders or the orders of the court is the person aware of the orders? Has the person been served with the order? So there's an element of investigation as to how the environment is being handled. When the person has been especially represented in court, because I do know that state officers and state councils are representing this gentleman before court. The interaction between the judge and the law and the circumstances, especially the councils that are representing the gentleman, will then inform the course of action to be taken. Now remember, law serves many ways. One of it is a constant threat to an offender. That then brings out the deterrent aspect. You see, people obey laws because they have a disposition to obey law. Others obey law because it is bad to break the law, and therefore you will be punished. Now that's the foremost thing. Why we make laws and we delineate the circumstances which you operate within the confines of the law, and if you pass the boundaries set out by parliament or by law, then you get punished. The reason for that is because we want to create a constant threat and a reminder that then your liberty is going to be taken away if you disobey the law. And therefore, if there are delineations that have been created, obey the following orders, and you disobey them, the law says, and should be, as has been applied, that you've crossed your boundaries, and therefore there are consequences. So a conviction is not a simple matter. A conviction means that the next thing is certain liberties are going to be taken away. The liberties are what you usually would ordinarily enjoy in the Constitution. The whole Bill of Rights, one of it can be taken away on account of the fact that you disobeyed the law. It could be a jail term, it could be that your properties could be sequestered for purposes of then compensating the public for disobedience. So disobedience is an act against a society, against the Kenyans themselves. And therefore, I think this conviction was purely then to enhance and pump the fear that the law is supposed to, in fact, to have an effect on the subjects that are ultimately or overtly disobeying court orders.
And it will be interesting to see what kind of sentences are meted out on these three gentlemen, C.S. Matiang'i, IG Police Inspector General Joseph Boynet, and Immigration Chief Gordon Kihalangwa. They're due for sentencing this morning. That will be big news.